Hi everyone, this tutorial is about Photoshop brushes and how you can get started with very simple and basic settings in the brush for the brush tool. In all honesty, when I'm doing digital painting, I use very little manipulation or setting manipulation. I use very basic brushes. In fact, in a digital painting, let's just pick, for example, a painting that I've recently done. Allow me to search for this painting. I have some samples here. Let's just say I would choose this one that I've just done. Okay, now this painting was done with only about two different brushes, probably three. Um, but even then, there is only one main brush that does most of the artwork that is used mostly in the most of the artwork, but the rest is all very supplementary. For example, I have like a texture brush to just give the the edge of the moon a bit of a fuzz, a feathered brush to give it a glow, but generally to create all of these lines and these textures here, and even to paint the body of this girl, I would be using one brush and one brush only. I find that it's a lot more useful, it feels a lot more real, because as much as Photoshop, you'll be tempted to use all sorts of different brushes when you're using Photoshop because of how the library can be quite endless, like the one I have here. But really, when you talk about it in real life, do you really paint with that many brushes when you are painting in real life, like for example with physical mediums like acrylic and watercolors, or even with oil paints? Usually you use just one or two, right, which is about the same. I like to approach Photoshop the same way. Now, there are a few things that I will address in this tutorial. Number one is about line thickness, which is very crucial when you're doing illustration. I always look for quality of lines when I'm assessing students' work. I think it's very important to have that kind of quality of line in your illustration. It gives your illustration a lot more character, looks a lot more professional. Number two is shape dynamics and scattering, which is a setting in the brush tab here. And then we're going to be talking about color dynamics, and finally tablet pressures. So this is a relatively short tutorial. It will help you get started on using brushes in Photoshop. Okay, so let's get started by just opening a basic document, an A4 one, international paper. You don't need 300 dpi, you just need 200. Okay, so now the best way to look at a brush is in brush settings. Now, where do you get these tabs from, this brush and this brush preset? If you do not see it already when you open Photoshop, simply go to the window panel and open up brush or brush presets. I usually like to have both of these open at the same time, because brush preset allows you to see what brush you are picking and how it looks like. It has a nice preview mode. If you don't see this and you see something else, for example, like text only, you can go up here to the menu, the drop-down menu, and choose stroke thumbnail. I feel that this should be the only way to see a brush, because you can see the sample of how the brushes look like when you use it. And I mean, how else would you want to choose? It's so difficult to actually understand what the text mean unless you've memorized how all of them look like. Um, so obviously the best one is the stroke thumbnail. Now, let's look at a simple round tip brush like this one here. Now I'm going to increase the size. How do you increase and decrease the size of a brush in Photoshop? You can obviously go up to here which says size, and you can drag the head up and down but there's a better way for you to do that, which is by clicking on two keys on the keyboard, which is the bracket key, and it's not this bracket, it's this one here next to the P, right? This one and this one. So this is to decrease size and this is to add size, okay? So now, let's take this brush for instance. It is at 6 point. It is at 6 points, so I want to increase it right now by clicking the close bracket button so it gets larger. Alright, so now obviously I do not have a mouse, I'm using a tablet. I think now you can have a more affordable range of tablets. Previously we would usually only use the Wacom because they were the main producer of tablets, but I myself am using a Huion and it works pretty fine except for a few difficulties, like it's not very sensitive around the edges, which to me is not too much of a bother. Alright, so now if I press harder, obviously the lines get thicker just like a pencil, so it's trying to simulate very real physical mediums. And if I let go, as you can see, a little bit more, the size will decrease, but also not just the size, but you notice the opacity of the color decreases as well. So if I really press down right now with my tablet onto my tablet, the opacity and the color would increase. And if I slowly let go, not only does the size but also the value of the line, right? Now it's a bit jagged here because I'm moving rather slowly, but if you move faster, obviously you get a lot smoother lines. Alright, so now you notice that this happens, this opacity, this change in the opacity. Now if you do not want that to happen, you want constant solid lines like in comic books, as if you're using an ink pen, which of course does not have things like this. This would only happen if you're using like color pencils and things like that. You switch off this option here. Okay, tablet pressure controls opacity. So you deactivate that. And what happens is, now if you draw any line, you will notice you will not get this change in the opacity. So you can see the difference right here now, right? Between this stroke and this stroke. So I switch it on again. See? I can only get to this very dark opacity only if I press really hard. Okay? Now, this option here allows you to control the opacity of the brush. If I deactivate this, now the lines are this thick, right? Because this is the color I've chosen. Now, if I dial this down to 57, you notice that it's a lot lighter. Okay, if I go and bring it down some more, it gets even lighter. So this is where you adjust the opacity of your brush, right? Okay, let's clear the board. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is how brushes are made in Photoshop. They are not actually an entire stroke. What each stroke is made out of, for example, this one I've just used, right? It looks like a beautiful, nice, smooth stroke, correct? Yeah. But what it is actually how Photoshop creates brush strokes is by aligning and accumulating, shapes continually one after another. One way of showing you how it works is here. You see this beautiful stroke here that is smooth and tapered. If I were to adjust this spacing, pull it apart, you notice that bumps start to appear, and if I continue pulling it, you will notice that the line and the stroke is actually made out of circles, right? So that's what it is. Photoshop brushes are made out of continuous shapes. So you can actually make a dotted line, for example, like this one now. Instead of a stroke that I previously got, right now, if I pull it apart, what you can get is a dotted line. See, right? So it is applied for most of the brushes here in Photoshop. Okay, for example, if I choose this brush here, which I use a lot, which I used in the painting that I showed you earlier, it has a very nice pastel or acrylic sort of a feel, yeah, because you can almost see the little grains in the brush strokes. Now this is oddly made up of like a sponge sort of texture. So if I decrease the size, you will notice that it's made out of this, which is why when you go to brush preset, it shows you a stroke and also the shape that it is made out of, right? Which is here. All along here, you will see that you can see the shape that it's made out of and what it looks like as a stroke. Okay, now, so this is the brush tip shape. Let's choose a simple brush to talk about this area here, which is the next area we're going to go into. All right, yeah. So line thickness was covered, and now we're going to go into shape dynamics and scattering. Now, which is these two options? There are lots of options here, but in all honesty, I would only use these few. You could, of course, experiment with the rest. Sometimes I do use wet edges, but very rarely. I would usually use that to create like photographic bokeh on my illustration. If I'm kind of illustrating a small creature and I want the background to be blurred, I would use this. Now, let's start off with the brush tip shape. Actually, there are some options here that we can talk about. Now, what does brush tip shape do? Number one, of course, you have seen just now I've demonstrated is the spacing, where you can space apart every single image in the stroke so that you can get from something like this to something like this, right? And then the hardness. What is the hardness about? It's actually fuzzing up the brush. So that allows you to fuzz up your brush a little bit more, right? It's like feathering, okay? And what else can you do with your brush? You can also change the flatness of the brush, like this, yeah? So you can make sort of, if I push it together and re-angle it, you can get sort of an italic pen. Like this. Right? Hello. Let's complete the hello. Okay, so you can play around with the shape here by compressing it, changing the angle. Obviously, if the brush is a round shape, then turning it whatever angle would not make any difference because it is a circle, right? So this is in brush tip shape. Now, if you go to shape dynamics, for example, okay, it is important for me to kind of put the size jitter to the bottom here. Now, what does size jitter mean? If this is according to pen pressure, then it would mean that the brush would create a stroke based on how much pressure that you put on. The harder, the thicker, of course, the lighter or the more gingerly you move your pen over the tablet, the more finer it gets, right? Now, what else can you do? Let's choose a brush that has a bit of texture like this one here. Let's go to shape dynamics. Now, what is minimum diameter? Is basically, if you look at this right now, let's increase the size. Now, if I were to create a stroke like this, this is the smallest diameter I can get. Now, if I increase the minimum diameter, you will notice that the smallest stroke I can get is a little larger right now because I've increased the minimum diameter. Obviously, if I push it all the way to 100, it would mean that there is no minimum diameter and that I'm just using one maximum diameter. So no matter how hard or how softly you press, it's only one size. Okay, so minimum diameter meaning how small can the stroke go based on the pressure that you put. Okay, so I usually like to switch this on because it does give a very real feel to your stroke. Okay, now angle jitter. This is interesting because it can only be done if you have like a textured brush like this, which is the brush I'm using. Now, angle jitter, if you observe here as I change the percentage, what it does, it takes that texture and it turns it around. Jitter is a word where it's kind of like what you, if you know what it means, it's kind of randomized. So if you change that around and you base it on pen pressure, for example, it would shift the angle of the texture brush based on the pressure of your pen. Yeah, so now from that very smooth brush here, once I activate angle jitter and increase the percentage on it, you notice that now it's become like a crayon sort of a thing, which is very interesting, right? Now for me, roundness jitter is a little bit like this brush tip shape option here. So I don't really manipulate it that much, but it kind of flattens or straightens out your texture. Okay, so the most I would usually use from the shape dynamic section is size jitter and also angle jitter. Okay, so let's clean up our plate once again, our canvas, and let's go and talk about scattering. All right, now scattering is an interesting option. Let's go back to shape dynamics and kind of dial this down. You see, it's very interesting when you have this at 0, angle jitter at 0, but with pen pressure control, you can really see how interesting your strokes can get, right? It has this kind of contour going on. Now, with scattering, okay, what scattering does is, let's take for example this brush here now, okay? Switch on scattering. When you do the stroke without activating the scatter, right, it's a nice straight line. Okay, now if you scatter it out, notice how the brush changes here. Okay, if you scatter it out, it means that because all of your brushes move along the texture of this brush is made out of circles, right? So they move along like an axis. But if you increase the scatter, what it does is that it moves out of that axis. Yeah, so you can see how the shape has changed when I increase the scatter, right? So it's moving out of the axis now, right? Previously there was an axis, now it's moving out of that straight axis, okay? And if you do count, it would mean that it increases the amount of texture there is in that path, okay? So the best way to see is, let's go back to brush tip shape and increase the scattering. So let's go to scatter, right? So you can see it is at 0%, it's all very nicely aligned, right? But when you increase it, see, it gets more and more and more scattered, right? Yeah, so I hope that helps clarify what scatter is. And count would mean that previously, if my scatter had like 2, the count would increase the amount of circles coming out of this brush even more. Okay, right? Okay, so now we've covered shape dynamics and scatter. Let's move on to color dynamics, which is not much different from shape dynamics. Let's go back to a basic simple brush once again. this one here. Obviously, this one has to involve some color so that it gives it an interesting color. Okay, let's choose this nice blue because I like blue. Okay, it's kind of like a turquoise, blue-green color. Alright, now if I have a foreground background jitter, what's that? Okay, it refers to these two squares on your color palette. The one in front is the foreground color, the one in the back is the background color. Alright, the one here in white. So if I do this right now, it's at 0%, so it's only foreground. But if I increase the percentage and start doing this, you'll notice a gradation of different white. Let's go in closer to this shot. White and turquoise in different range of values. So it's kind of going back and forth, these two colors. Let's try and see if we change this background color to, say, a lime green. So you will find that lime green is now replacing the white color here. Okay, so that's what foreground background jitter does. It creates a very nice effect. You can use it to create a worm or probably a coconut tree. It gives a very nice, interesting texture. And then now with hue jitter, let's dial this back down. With hue jitter, what does hue mean? Hue means the different colors, right? I usually like to use a HSB palette because it corresponds very nicely to hue, saturation, and brightness. Why I usually use this palette is, for example, if I have this color, if I wanted to make it lighter, for example, I would go to brightness B and probably bring the B up, and I would get a more brighter or rather a higher value of this color. If I wanted a less saturated version of this color, I just go to S and dial it down, and I will get a less saturated version. Okay, so it's a lot easier to paint like that rather than CMYK or RGB. For example, if I were to use an RGB, if I wanted this color, a darker version of this color, it's going to be very hard to adjust because I don't know what to push up or down because it's red, green, and blue, right? There's no black in RGB palette. Now let's go back to here, talking about hue, saturation, and brightness. Now with hue, obviously hue is the top one here. So it talks about color, right? So if I were to use the stroke right now, let's choose blue again. And if I increase the amount of jitter or the randomness of this stroke, what will happen is you will notice that different colors start coming out. But it is still within the cool color range. It's still very close to this blue color that we see here, right? Yeah. If you push it further, you'll find more different colors coming out. And if you push it all the way, obviously you would get a rainbow, right? Now, if we talk about saturation, you would get brush with the same color stroke but with different and varying saturation. And finally, with brightness, you can get something like this, right? So this is saturation and this is brightness, right? If you bump them all up, then obviously you would get something very strange like this, which is interesting if you have a sort of style or art that uses this sort of color, I guess. Yeah, it is quite interesting. In fact, you could make a very nice worm, sort of a, oops, sorry. Let's put this back to white. So if you had a sort of worm texture like this, right, I could, oh, sorry, I made it on the same layer as the background. Let's create a new layer. So you had a worm texture, lock the alpha, Let's choose a nice soft brush to give it some form of a texture, right? It's quite interesting. Let's lower the opacity of this. Yeah, so it gives this word sort of depth. So it's quite interesting. Okay, all right. Now, there's a brush option to a brush that I just used that you might be thinking, what is this about? Which is mode here. You'll find mode over here for your brush settings, but you also find mode in your layers. Now, what is mode? It's a type of transparency, but that will be covered in a different tutorial. So if you hit subscribe on this video, I will definitely try and get some time to actually develop that video and tell you more about what transparencies are. It's quite fundamental in digital painting. Now, let's go on to the last topic that we have, which is tablet pressure, which actually we have already covered earlier on. So if we go here, once again, yeah, this little tool here is the tablet pressure that we're talking about. Let's go back here to make sure that the setting, so we see with tablet pressure it looks like this. Without, you'll notice that, with tablet pressure is like this. Without is like this, is flat, right? So if I unlock the alpha, this is with tablet pressure, without tablet pressure. So just a recap actually. So this basically covers a lot of things that you can do with Photoshop already. One last thing I would like to teach you how to do is to save a brush that you've created that you like. So if I go to brush preset, let's choose an interesting brush to create. This is one I've made custom. Now, how do I make this? I made this brush, the scattering sort of a brush, with this brush, which is the one I just used, right? It's a simple brush. Now, how did I manipulate it and how do I actually save it? So I go to here. First thing, if you look at this brush I've created, it's got made of flat spheres, correct? So what I do is flatten my shape, and obviously I can't have a continuous stroke anymore. So what I do is I increase the spacing as much as I can, and then I go to scattering, and automatically scattering gets activated, and move down the count. I don't want too many, I don't want it to be too messy, and increase the scatter. So now I've got this interesting brush that is very nice for, let's say you want to create some ground texture, or sand or gravel. So that's very useful here. Okay, so now how do I save it? It's very simple. You go to the top menu here and say new brush preset. All right, then save whatever name. You can name it whatever you want. You can name it gravel. Okay, and now where is this brush saved? Now you go to your brush preset and go all the way down to your menu, and it's right here. So any new brushes that are created in Photoshop will appear here. All right, so once again, if you find this video interesting and useful, do click subscribe on my YouTube channel, and more of these videos will be introduced to you to help you get started with digital painting. All right, so do stay tuned for 2 more videos which will be very useful in tandem with this one, which is how to create custom brushes, as not just this one, but actually taking like different textures to make custom brushes, and also the other one about transparencies. All right, see you soon.